Welcome to Tender, Strong, and True. My name is Monsignor Michael Heintz. I'm the director of the Master of Divinity program in the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. Our topic today is maintaining a spiritual life, navigating the temptations of competition. Joining me today are two members of the Notre Dame family. Professor Tim Gilbride is Associate Professor of Marketing in the Mendoza College of Business. He's been a member of the Notre Dame family since 2004. He teaches courses in marketing and with a special emphasis on quantitative analysis and consumer trends. He and his wife Teresa have 3 children. Also joining us is Dean Carolyn Wu, well known at Notre Dame and beyond, Dean of the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame. I'd like to welcome them both. Thank you for being here today. In the gospel, there's a creative tension between competition as a good. St. Paul encourages us to fight the good fight and to run the race with great vigor. And at the same time, the gospel teaches us to die to self and to live for others. And because of this creative tension, we live in a society that, because of its emphasis on competition, can provide great temptations to the believer in the world today. How do we make sense of competition in our lives as Christians? How can it be something fruitful and helpful? How should it be avoided? What aspects of it are dangerous? How do we parse the differences between good and bad competition? And what strategies might we employ in our lives today in making sense of these differences? I'd like to begin our conversation today by asking Tim, what is the place, is there a place for competition in the life of anyone today in our world, especially someone who's a Christian?
Well, certainly we really can't avoid competition. And from a business perspective, as customers, we want competition, right? We want to make sure that there are many firms competing to give us the goods and services that we want. We want to make sure that resources are being efficiently used and allocated. And competition helps that along. We would be pretty suspicious or we get weary in our economic life if we feel that there's a lack of competition, that one firm is dominating the competitive landscape. So certainly in that respect, there is a good role that competition plays in a macro perspective. Mm-hmm. I would say as well in the individual perspective. Carolyn?
I would say, Father, that competition in our own personal life has a constructive role if we do it properly. So I think competition allows us to set a goal, and we want to practice, and it requires discipline. It trains us to have a certain degree of commitment, and it allows us to be better. And competition is healthy when it's not just about winning, but also learning how to lose. So I think that without competition, we are not necessarily better off. It's a matter of what is the proper role of competition.
Mm-hmm. I think in our society today, especially from adults in business to children in music competitions, academic competitions in school, and certainly in sports, you as parents must deal with this quite frequently with your own children. You have children at home. How do you help them make sense of how competition can be something good in their life?
Well, you know, it's interesting. When my kids were very young, they just sort of naturally celebrated sort of other folks winning things. You know, that Susie's the best speller, or Brother Harry did well in this or that. And then it's only sort of as they get a little bit older that they see competition more as there being winners and losers. And they become sensitized to the fact that they can be losers. Mm-hmm. But we have to remind them, almost pull them back to remind them of the joy that they have when somebody else does something good. And that someone else doing well doesn't mean necessarily that you're doing anything poorly or doing mm-hmm. not as well. Mm-hmm.
And I could actually give an example. I have 2 sons. When the older one went for basketball, in the early years, freshman and sophomore years, junior varsity, he worked very hard. We got up very early, he practiced, he learned to enjoy basketball, enjoy the games. When he was a junior, he didn't make it on varsity. I remember the day he came home, he was so very disappointed. He was just downcast. And we knew he needed a few hours just to handle that. But after that, it was the opportunity of a conversation. And for us to signal an appropriate role for basketball in his life. That he could still enjoy basketball, he could still play on his side, even though he was not part of the team. And to be able to celebrate that team, his school team, doing well. And up to now, 8 years or even more after that, 10 years after that, he still plays basketball and enjoys it. And I would say a few years after that, when he was a senior, his younger brother, who was a freshman, made it onto the team. And also to see the grace of 2 brothers being able to manage that dynamic. The younger one who made it on the team, the sense of grace and sensitivity to an older brother who did not, and the older brother who is able to really just enjoy his brother doing this. So I think that the role of parents in these situations is very important, and so I see this as a healthy opportunity to engage two sons in sort of the later events they will face in their lives.
Sure, and that's all possible because simply a conversation you had with them about the very things they were experiencing.
And how we signal who they are.
And your acceptance and love of them regardless of whether they made the team or not, and the older son's ability to rejoice in the younger son's making the team. That's beautiful. I think, too, for many people, whether we're talking about younger people in sports or older people in business or their work, we sometimes so identify ourselves with what we do that our self-worth or self-esteem is so caught up in that when that's lost or when it's not achieved, we feel personally as if we failed. And we need to be able to make that distinction, I think.
Yeah, one of the things we tend to do is really compartmentalize our life. You know, this is my working life, and that's separate from my family life, and that's separate from the things that I pursue just for out of hobbies, and that's separate from my spiritual life. And I think we get hung up on competition when we just pick one of those compartments and say, well, if I'm not the winner in this, whatever that means, then somehow all these other things don't matter. And we really need to avoid that. And certainly spiritual life encompasses all these different aspects of our existence. And we shouldn't put too much emphasis on one to the expense of another. And we shouldn't look for validation of the complete package by just focusing on the one.
It seems to be a lot of this has to do with validation we receive outside of ourselves.
And Father Mike, I would say, is very realistic for people to be very identified with their title. You know, we say we're not what we eat and we're not what we buy, but I think that most people would admit their title means a lot to them. We tend to define ourselves by our title. If nothing else, we spend, 10 hours a day acting in that role. And I think that requires really explicit reflection and attention to know how much we hang on to that and how unhealthy it is. I was talking to a CEO who just retired, and he told me to prepare for his retirement. He spent 2 years talking to a counselor just to be ready to deal with the day when he doesn't have a title. So I think here is to accept that power, the power of that title to capture us completely, and to know that therefore it requires a lot of work to put it in its proper place.
Well, and I think that shows a great deal of self-awareness to be able to recognize that in oneself. I know as folks retire, I've talked to people who they've worked very hard all their life to build up their business, and that business is in a sense their life. But to step away from it is very hard because at the same time they have nothing apart from that to identify themselves with. They haven't had time to have hobbies or pursuits apart from that, and it's very hard to make that adjustment, I think, away from that. And again, if your self-worth is so identified in that, you then struggle personally. And I think to be able to realize that this is going to be a struggle for me and to move beyond that is really valuable. I want to thank both of you very much, Tim and Carolyn.